Hi everyone and welcome. In this video tutorial we're going to be going through creating a Red Hat 7 virtual machine that we're going to be using for some of our future labs in the systems course. I've already got VMware Player 12 open, so I'm going to create a new virtual machine. Launch that. We're going to have to navigate to the actual ISO that contains CentOS 7, this one here, 64-bit. I'll open that, and when we do, you'll notice that CentOS 64 bits already installed, so we don't have to tell it what operating system we're going to install. So we'll click Next. I have to give this a name. This is going to be KW Linux 01. We also have to have a location. So I'm going to put this on my SSD and in info 2270, and I'm going to put this in the class demo folder. That's a little bit different than your lab, but all it is the path. And then I'm going to make sure that KW Linux 07 is on the end of this path, because we don't want to end up with different files from different VMs being added into the same folder. Once we have that done, we can say next. 20 gigabyte disk is fine, more than what we need. We're going to store this as a single file, as we usually do. I don't want to power on when I'm finished because I have a couple of quick things I want to take a look at. So we'll finish that up and we can see the VMs created. So I'm going to edit the VM settings very quickly. A gigabyte of memory is more than enough for what we're doing, but that's fine. I also want to get rid of the printer because we don't really need that, so I'm going to remove that from the list and say OK. So we're basically ready to start installing. So I'm going to launch the VM, and that will come up and present us with our initial installer screen. So I'm just going to click in the window here. I'm using the arrow keys to select between the menu items. You can see that we can either install CentOS 7 or we can test the media. Now, testing the media is basically there to make sure that there's no corruption in the ISO file. And if I was going to be taking this ISO file off site and I didn't have a good internet connection or something, I'd probably do that ahead of time. But in our particular case, if there was corruption, all I'd have to do is download a new copy of the ISO file, so not a big deal. So I'm going to skip the test. I'll just go to install, hit enter, and the installer is going to start up. Now, in a second, what will happen is we're going to be presented with a screen. It's basically a GUI installer that's quite similar to what you see in Windows as far as format's concerned. This is something in the Linux world that is called Anaconda. And there's a prompt here to press enter to begin the installation process. If I ignore that, that will time out after a few seconds and just start on its own. And we can see that happening now. So we have a bunch of software that's loading in the background for the installer to actually work, setting up the basic environment so that we can actually run the installation process. Along the bottom, there's a bit of a prompt. If you wanted to install using text mode rather than the GUI mode, you could actually select that, and then everything that you would do would basically be from the command prompt. This part of it will do the easy way and use the GUI. So the first thing we have an opportunity to do here is select our language and our keyboard layout. In our particular case, English for language is good, and US English for the keyboard is good as well. Don't need to make any changes here. We'll say continue. And now we come to the screen that gives us a number of different items that we can set up. So there's a couple things that we have to do. One of them is make sure we have the time zone correct. So I'm going to select on that. And if on the map you click somewhere close to a city that you're in, then you're going to be good. So I'm going to select up here in Southern Ontario, and you'll notice that it comes up to Toronto. So that'll give us Eastern Standard Time. We can change the time here if we want. If we use an NTP server, then that'll update automatically. We're not going to use network time yet because we have no network, so we'll get to that another time. Once you're set, done, and that brings us back out to this screen. We can add a secondary keyboard and language if we want. We're not going to do that. We're just going to leave this the way it is. And I'm going to scroll down here a little bit for a couple of other items. If you want to install from something other than the ISO, then you would change this here. We don't, so I'll leave that alone. Also, as far as what software do we want to install, if you select this, you'll notice that minimal install is the default, and that's actually what we're going to put in. There's a number of different base configs that you see along the side, and then for each one of those, there's a number of different options over on the right that you can choose. I'm going to leave that for you to kind of look around at when you're working with your lab. For us, we're going to do a minimal install, and that will do very fine for what we're going to be working with in the labs. Just going to click on Done. Now we see a warning sign that's over top of the disk configuration. So I'm going to select that, and we don't have to make any changes to it, but the way that things are set up right now is there's going to be a default partitioning structure. And that default partitioning structure, basically the installer wants us to confirm that we're going to use that or manually go off and do something else. You'll notice that most people will tell you that preference, I should say, is that we actually go through and manually configure the partitions. And if we actually have our disk layout ahead of time and we know what it is we're planning to do, that is definitely the best thing to do. For our purposes, though, the partitioning scheme that's going to be used is just fine. So I'll click on Done. And what you'll notice in a second here is that this warning will go away, and we're now ready to actually start installing if we wish with Begin Installation. Before we do that, though, there's also another option down here for configuring the network, and we're going to do that now. The reason we want to configure the network ahead of time is that if you don't configure it now, you will actually have to go and manually set up the network once the system is finished installing, and you will have no network connectivity if you don't do that. Since going through and editing all of the different network files can be a little bit challenging, especially in the beginning, we're going to configure the network at this time so it's up and running when we're good to go. So I'm going to pick on the network and host name. Right now we have one network adapter, that's our Ethernet adapter, that's connected onto the NAT network. So I'm going to go in and configure that because we want static. So I'll say configure. This is the adapter that we're working with. We can see that there's a number of different settings in here. IPv4 is the one that I'm interested in, so I'll grab that. This is set by default to DHCP. I'm going to change this to manual. And once we've done that, we can start adding addresses. So I'm going to say add. I'll do 192.168.70. We're going to use .50 in this case. For subnet mask, you can either use 222.55.0 or just type in 24, which is going to be good for us. The gateway is going to be 192.168.70.2, which is on the NAT network, and we're good to go for that. So that's the IP setting. DNS servers, we have to put that in, so I'll select this 192.168.70.2. If we had our Windows environment up and running, we could actually point this at our domain controller and use that for DNS as well. But we're not going to rely on that. So instead, we'll just point off to the internet and through our NAT device. Search domain, we're going to want this to be our lastname.local, so we'll put that in. That way, if we don't add a domain on for the fully qualified domain name, that'll get added on automatically. And that's basically all we need to configure in here. So I'll save that. And we're back out to the network page. Now, I do want to set my host name. So I'm going to come in here and say this is going to be KW Linux 01.mydomain Dixon.local. We definitely want to fully qualify the domain name. Case doesn't matter. In Unix, you typically find people using lowercase, so I'll use that. And then the last thing we want to do is turn the network on. So I'll just switch the adapter from off to on. You'll see it's connected. Here is the IP configuration, and we're set. So I can done from here and then begin the installation. So basically what's happening now, you can see some messages down here. It's setting up the environment. It's creating the disk. In a minute, it's going to actually start copying a bunch of packages in. While that's going on, we have an opportunity to set the root password or the administrative password and create another user for ourselves if we want to. Now, we're not going to create another user, but we are going to set the root password. So I'm going to select that. I can punch in the password, so I'm going to use our standard secret 55 for that. You'll notice we're getting a warning that the password is weak, which is okay. I don't really care about that so much for this server. But one of the things that's an issue here is if we're going to force it to use this weak password, we have to click on done twice. So I clicked it once. It says, hey, wait a minute. I'll click it again. We're back out. We can see that the root password's set. It's not going to create a user. And at this point in time, it's installing a whole bunch of libraries and software. So this is going to take a few minutes. When it's done, it's going to require a reboot. So I'm going to pause the video for now. And when we come back, we'll go through the reboot and do a little bit of post-installation config and testing. Back in a few minutes. Okay, we're back. And the system is now finished installing. We can see the complete message and ready for reboot. So I'll just do the reboot. The system will reload, and when it's done, we'll be ready to log in. When we get there, we'll see that we're going to be using command prompt only. Also, we have a boot menu. The top item is the default boot. The one underneath it is rescue. So if you get to the point where something's not working, you can simply use the rescue, and then that will boot up, kind of like a safe mode environment that we can use to get software back into the state that we want. So the system's ready to log in, and in this particular case, we're going to use the root user account, which is the same as administrator in Windows. We'll put in our secret 55 password, and we're logged in. We'll talk a little bit more later on about what the prompt means, but we're at the point now where we can just enter in commands and do whatever it is we need to do. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is check to make sure our network's working. So I'm going to start by pinging the default gateway. So 192.168.70.2, and that's successful. You can do Control-C to stop that. In the Unix world, ping does not stop after some given number of attempts. It just keeps on going. So use Control-C to kill the command. And let's make sure we can get to the internet. So I'll try pinging www.google.ca, and that works too. So we're in good shape from that perspective. Now, this is a VM running inside of VMware virtualization. So that means we need VMware Tools. This is pretty easy to do. What I'm going to do is say yum install and install open-vm-tools and say go ahead and do that. This is going out to the repositories, locating all the software, downloading it, so we're going to be ready to install. Now, while it's doing that, yum is the Yellow Dog Update Manager. That is the command that we use to manage software installation, update, all the rest of that kind of thing. One of the main arguments for yum is install. That is the one that I use to tell it I want to install something, and then once we've got that, all we do is tell it what it is we want to install. So let me scroll down to the bottom here. Basically, I'm at the point that it's figured out all the packages it has to install. It's asking me, is it okay to go ahead and do that? So my answers are yes, no, and first I'm going to say yes. And it's now downloading and installing all these packages. Now, one of the other things it's going to do is prompt us to find out if the security key to the repository is okay or not, if we're going to be happy with that. In fact, here's the prompt here. Now, it only does this once when you first start using it, but it wants us to confirm that we are connected properly to the actual repository for the software, and then it uses that key from now on to make sure that the secure connection with the software is good. If something happens that the key gets changed on the repository, we're going to have to respond to that again. Which is fine. You know, it's a good thing to be able to do. And if we end up getting hacked and we're redirected to a different repository, one that's kind of faking it, and trying to install some malware onto our system, we're going to get prompted again because they're not going to be able to reproduce that key from the public key pair. So at that point, we'd be, hey, wait a minute, something a little bit fishy going on here, and we could investigate that. Now we know the key is okay. I'll say yes. It's going through and doing the install after it's done the downloads, and we see we're back at the prompt. So our installation is now done, and that's it for VMware Tools. Notice there's no reboot, so a little bit different than what we see in the Windows world. Last thing we want to do for the install is we want to apply all the software updates. As you can probably imagine, we're going to use the yum command again for that. And in this case, what we do is say yum and then update. And I'll start that command. It's going to go out and look to find out all the different packages that there are updates for in the repository. It's found those now, so we see that there's 80 upgrade packages and then one install package. That install package is going to be something new that's not on there, and it's likely a dependency for one of the updates. So I'm going to say, yeah, go ahead and do that. And while it's off doing the download and then the installation of all those different packages, I'm going to go away for a bit and come back when that's done. So I'm going to pause the video, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're back. Our updates are all done. We can see a list here of all of the different software packages that were updated, and we're back to our command prompt. Now, in the Linux world, if a reboot's required, it will tell you, and it hasn't asked for one. However, when we do a pretty major update like this, it's a really good idea to do a reboot, just in case there happen to be some old libraries that are hanging around in memory or something like that and might cause us a problem. Doesn't happen very often. In fact, I've had that happen to me maybe once in all the time I've been using Linux. But never hurts to do a quick reboot since we'd be in a maintenance window anyway. So reboot, very simply, command is shutdown. Oops. Shutdown, -R for reboot when. We're going to say now. And enter, and we'll see that this will very quickly restart. You'll notice that there are additional options as compared to the original boot menu. That's because there was an update to the OS, so we can always go back and boot the old one if we want. By default, that's left on the system and in the boot menu. We can manually delete that if we don't need it, and in some organizations they do that for security purposes. Right. Now we're back to our login prompt, so we'll just do root and then our password. And we're back in, and that's basically it. So Linux is now installed. It's got all the updates applied. It has VMware Tools installed on it. We're basically ready to start using this for other purposes. Just before I go, I'll show you very quickly how to shut down when you're ready. Simply, again, use the shutdown command. Instead of R, we do H for halt. And then, again, now we want to do this immediately. And the system will shut down, and that's basically it. So that's the end of this video clip. Hopefully this has been helpful for you, and we'll see you in the next time.